Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. So today's topic is going to be on equitable rubrics. When I was growing up, equity was not a topic that was discussed frequently. So I am happy and glad that this is an ongoing conversation and that today at Fusion, I've been given a space to be able to talk to you about it. My hope is that you'll take some of it with you, reflect upon it, and also use it perhaps in your own classes. Okay, so this is the content that we will be discussing today. The first is an introduction to equity. The second here is some guidelines and some best practices on designing your rubric. And then the last topic will be on implementation. So just some techniques, some guidelines on how to use it on Brightspace specifically. Okay, so how can we define equity? We know that it is multifaceted, so it does look different for each student. We must also be aware that students do come from different backgrounds, different groups, different organizations and cultures, and so diversity and even equity for that matter can look different for me versus to you. The second thing here is to address disparities, and that's what equity really strives and seeks to do. So equity in the classroom, specifically with rubric design, can remove barriers, and thereby by removing barriers, we can learn to value diversity. And diversity, not so much, in perhaps students, but also in thought and also experience. We need to recognize that students do have varying experiences throughout all levels, and that is something that relates and ties very closely to equity. Also, fair treatment. So we must ensure that students are treated fairly. So regardless of gender, race, sex, socioeconomic state, we need to ensure that students have a fair treatment throughout the course, throughout the duration of their course. And then also achieving potential. So in order for us to help our students achieve that level of excellence in that particular course, it is important for us to be able to know and show them that they do have that potential to thrive in that course. And this ties back really well into the concept of equity. We want to make sure that the experience is the same at every level for each student. So why equity in rubric design? Well, for starters, as instructors, as leaders in the classroom, it's important that a culture of transparency is enabled. So it kind of ties into the previous statement before that since students come from different backgrounds, different learning environments, different organizations, different cultures, thereby each student must have different strengths and weaknesses. And the goal here is that the students must feel at ease and in the classroom, and this can be done by setting the tone of determining what's fair, what's not. In terms of inclusivity here, our next point, in order to be able to give that inclusive angle to our students, one really good thing to consider is having authentic assessments. So that can be through a variety of forms. So perhaps straying far away from multiple choice exams and having more classroom participation, having guest speakers, having that ability, that flexibility for students to show their creativity, to show that they reflected on the material. So that is really important to have. Now, we want to also ensure that our students are motivated. Sometimes this can happen from time to time, and from my personal experience of working in higher education for a number of years, it can be very frustrating when a student recognizes that the instructor is not familiar with technology or tech tools specifically that are geared towards equity, which ties into the art of rubric design essentially. And so this can lead to students feeling quite unmotivated in your class. And so to alleviate that, we want to ensure that instructors and administrators and faculty as well, they have proper knowledge and use of these learning tools. Okay, continuing on from our previous slide, reducing barriers to excellence. So I like to think of rubric design as an art form, right? So it's something that as instructors, we need to continuously work towards. I strongly feel that there is no perfect rubric design, and it would require a lot of trial and error, especially if you are a new instructor, especially if you're brand new to teaching. Even if you have been teaching for many years and it's a new course or there's a new curriculum involved, it just requires some time to put in the beginning. However, that time can yield a lot of benefits at the end if it's done correctly and if it's done, in an iterative format. Through this iteration, it can help your individual teaching and learning practices and pedagogies. So the art of rubric design, as you go through those iterative processes over and over again, it can really strengthen your individual learning and development as teachers, as professors, as instructors in the classroom. So some of the benefits to consider. Much research here does promote rubrics due to the objectivity and consistency. We know that if a rubric is present, then the expectations are laid out for the students, and so that can really help them succeed in the class. We also know that standardized rubrics have known to reduce bias, including personal bias within the assessment process. So think of it as having almost a blanket kind of like a statement where you're able to guide the students through whether or not they followed certain items on the rubric itself. Self-efficacy. So Albert Bandura coined this term in the 70s, and it just means the individual's belief in their ability to succeed or achieve their goals. Now, the caveat here is that there is limited research showing the connection between self-efficacy and rubric design. However, I've decided to leave that on here because I think it's important for us as instructors to try and also help the students motivate them essentially in doing well in that particular course. So I've left this on here because it can help some students achieve, their particular goals through your rubrics. Okay, so some of the guidelines here actually. So I've kind of divvied them up into 3 separate categories, and this is quite a lot that we're kind of discovering in a very short span of time. And essentially, this could technically be a course because it's quite nuanced and quite detailed. However, and you'll see that I've only really scratched the surface. But yeah, so moving on to variation. So we need to assess skills rather than task completion. And we're going to chat a little bit more about that in the next slide here. So instead of, if students have just answered the question, as opposed to more giving them more details on what they did right, what they did wrong, how they can essentially move forward in that particular course, in that particular assignment. So taking it a step further definitely helps. And then second thing here I've written is to focus on project-based assessments to showcase their abilities. So kind of ensuring that there are multiple opportunities for students here to essentially be, able to showcase their flexibility, their creativity, and really integrate themselves thoroughly with the material. There was a study done from Tufts University, and essentially it showed that if instructors and professors are able to provide their students with targeted support earlier on in the semester as opposed to later on, that seems to really help students be motivated and help them succeed in the classroom. The second guideline here is thoroughness, not roteness. So I've written an example here, but essentially this thoroughness versus roteness stems from a study that was done from the Stanford University. And these researchers found that individuals who essentially grew up in low SES economic backgrounds went to these types of schools that primarily focused more so on rote learning as opposed to thorough learning. And so, we're in the 21st century now, and we want to stray away from rote, and we want to integrate more thoroughness in the students' learning. So rote learning, for instance, would be an example of this would be in a few sentences, define the term. Imagine you were teaching a course on cultural awareness, and that was one of the key learning objectives. So a rote learning example would be in a few sentences, define the term cultural awareness. And then the second point here of thoroughness would be critically analyze the term cultural awareness and why it's important in the 21st century. Incorporate external references, lecture notes, your course text, and your personal experiences to explain your point of view. So you can see that one of them is more yes or no, and the other one is a lot more indicative of the students' personal experiences, and it's a lot more thorough in terms of its learning. Okay, the third item here is to minimize bias. So since rubric design does take a lot of time and effort, we want to ensure that these efforts are actually produce fruit, essentially yield some good results. And so you can try and do these 4 guidelines here. So the first is to reach out to faculty and staff with different point of view. And that's important too, because a senior individual who's been teaching a particular course for a longer period of time may have some really interesting ideas on what you could do better or what you could do differently. The second here is to have inclusive language. I'm sure all of us are already very familiar with this, but to avoid gender-specific criteria and some descriptors as well in your descriptors for the rubrics that you create. Review, revise, and repeat. Continuously learning, teaching and learning, and I think this is best practice to ensure that the rubrics are always updated, the curriculum, so that it actually matches the curriculum, and to continuously follow through in that revision of your particular course. And then, of course, we want to ensure that vague language or subjective language, for instance, is not used in the rubric, because that can be quite confusing for the students. Okay, so I have a little diagram here on implementing rubrics, which I'm sure Brightspace D2L has a lot of information on, but essentially just quickly walk through it. You go to course tools, discussions, edit topic, and then add rubric. It's fairly straightforward and pretty easy to use. And then, you move on to assessment, add rubric, save and close. And currently, there are 2 options, so holistic and analytical. So this is what an analytical rubric looks like. So it is a 2-dimensional rubric, essentially, with levels of achievement, and you can assign different values to different criteria. So on the diagram here, you can see there's about 5 categories, and each of them have 4 categories, sorry, and each of them have a percentage attached to them. So this makes it really easy for a student to look at it and to kind of assess where they need to stand and, what grade essentially they want to achieve. And this was taken from the University of British Columbia, and it serves as a good example. Holistic rubrics, again, this is the other type of rubrics. So this is single criteria to assess achievements, and they're usually written in paragraphs or full sentences. So as you can see, the score is on the left side, and there's some criteria for a research paper. And again, I want to iterate that, it's not it might not be a perfect rubric to you, but I think it serves as a good idea of what instructors are capable of doing for their specific course and what is required in that particular outline, and depending on what the learning objectives are. Okay, so here are some recommended practices. So consider adding these to your course or reflecting upon them. Some of these do's and don'ts may be of value to you. So the first one here is to utilize announcements. This is a key feature on Brightspace D2L, and it can really help students, especially if you teach in a virtual capacity, to understand the material and to also be aware of what's coming up in the week or what has been done throughout the week. The second item here I have is to offer comprehensive instructions within the rubric versus delaying feedback. So it's important that when we are designing these rubrics, there are instructions attached to the assignment, or you're talking about it with the student versus delaying that or not giving them any feedback at all. So that can be very not useful to the student. The last thing here is to explain the rubric carefully, versus providing vague details. I know some instructors that I do work with will take the time at the beginning of the class to have a chat with the students, make them, just sit down with them and explain to them what the rubrics are, what the assignments are, what the course outline looks like, how the semester is going to go. You can also incorporate student feedback earlier on and ask them what's fair, what's not. What defines 100% on the rubric? What defines 10% on the rubric? You can go through those categories with them and really get their feedback as well. That's also a great idea to ensure that there's equity in this type of rubric design. And that concludes the presentation. So thank you all so much. Feel free to connect with me. I'm happy to hear from you.